Victor Shamas. Please join me in welcoming Victor Shamas.
Well, I just have to say that that might be my favorite introduction I've ever received. And so I feel very welcome in Austin after that. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Lynn, for having me and putting up with me. And so I'm here to share something about a 30-year journey, as Joe told you. I'm inspired by inspiration, that moment of insight, aha, eureka. And I've been dedicated 30 years of my life to that momentary experience. I'm inspired by your inspiration. Whatever inspires you or how you get inspired. Joe shared an epiphany he had last night. And that kind of thing is a thrill for me. It's an honor to be around those experiences. And you think about those experiences, they have a way of changing the world. So Harriet Beecher Stowe was receiving communion one day, and she fell into a trance. And in that trance, she had the key scene in Uncle Tom's Cabin came to her. Robert Louis Stevenson had these visitations from these little people called brownies that would tell him stories. He would say, the stories were really good, but they needed some editing. So my job was really just to edit down these stories. So the stories that we know that Robert Louis Stevenson told the world came from these brownies in these moments of inspiration. Mary Shelley had a revelation, possibly drug-induced, that gave rise to Frankenstein. Nikola Tesla, fascinating man, one of the brilliant inventors in human history. His invention of the AC generator came while he was walking along. He was strolling after dinner with a friend who was probably an engineer like him and reciting Goethe to his friend. And just at that moment, it hit him, and he got the vision in its entirety for the AC generator. He picked up a stick and he drew it out in the dirt. He said, this is how this thing works. And in a momentary flash, something that he had been working on, now I don't want to dismiss preparation, but at that moment, something that wasn't just cognition happens. And I want to know what that is, because March 16th, 1987, I had my own such moment. And I had this moment of inspiration that I had been a chemist. And as a chemist, I was hired to teach in a program called tropical biology. Don't ask me why. I told my college, I don't know anything about tropical biology. If you're okay with that, I'm happy to go teach in Hawaii. They sent me to Hawaii with a group of 35 students. I was 25 years old. And I fell in love with coral reefs. And then I said, I am going and following my passion for coral reefs. And I got to Australia. And I was a few miles from the Great Barrier Reef, staying on an island called Fitzroy Island. At that point, a girlfriend had decided to join me on my trip. Possibly not a great idea. We weren't getting along harmoniously. And so we had a very huge blowout, and I took off to go sit under the stars and look at the Southern Cross. That's what this image is, the Southern Cross. If you've ever had the pleasure of seeing the Southern Cross in the Southern Hemisphere, it's a beautiful sight. And at that moment, I said to myself, because I know I said this because I have it in my journal from 30 years ago, there has to be more than the daily crises of personality. There has to be more. And at that moment, something shifted, and I had this moment of inspiration, and I felt expanded. I had this sense of presence, of being beyond my body, of feeling connected to everything. I had this sensation of energy, and I know that this group probably hears a lot about energy, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it today. And then I heard this voice. I actually feel like I fell into a reverie, sleep state, I don't know what. And I heard a voice that was about as close, I hope you don't mind me doing this, as this. And it said, "You are greater than you ever imagined." And I love that you laughed at that. It was a revolution because I knew that voice wasn't talking about me specifically. It was talking about you and me. And then I thought, we've underestimated ourselves. And the fact that there's this voice speaking to me, that moment changed my life. I shifted from chemistry I decided I had to shift out of chemistry, come back to the US, figure out what I was studying. Was it education, psychology? I didn't know. I moved to Tucson because they had a consciousness studies program at the University of Arizona. And I decided I need to study the interface between consciousness and creativity. So I came to a place that had a consciousness studies program and had a pretty renowned creativity researcher. So it was a really great fit. And I never left. But one of the things I found is that the scientists don't really have a good handle on either consciousness or creativity. It's very ironic, really, that this is the case, that they confound consciousness with mind. And I see that, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment, there's a difference. And it's not surprising that they do that because the researchers are intellectuals. So if you ask a researcher in my department, what would happen if you stopped thinking? Would you have a conscious experience outside of thought? They would say, no, that's called death. Consciousness, there's no consciousness without thought. And I go, okay, there's probably like, I don't know, 1 billion, 2 billion meditators in the world who you might have wanted to consult before coming to that conclusion. So that's an issue. And it dates back to William James, who's the granddaddy of American psychology. If you look at the back of Deep Creativity, you're going to find in the appendix an article I wrote and submitted to a variety of consciousness journals, none of whom wanted to publish it. And I basically said, William James got it wrong. Because he wrote this chapter about the characteristics of consciousness, and at one point he called it something related to consciousness, and another point, a very similar chapter, he referred to the characteristics of mind. So he conflated the two right off the bat. And the field of psychology, which reveres William James, continued that pattern. Meanwhile, creativity is equated with thinking. Again, you're talking about intellectuals. So when you ask intellectuals about what the creative process is, it's a creative thinking process. And so and that has been effective to a certain degree. I don't want to dismiss it. So you can program a computer, Lord knows that's happening as we speak, to do things that might be considered creative, to generate products that are considered creative. But I'm interested in the experience that a human being has in their body when they create. And I'm not convinced the computer, I don't think the computer is doing that. They might be producing a product, but that's not the same. So I decided to take a first-person approach. In 1996, I sat down to try to write this book. And I sat and stared at a blank computer screen a lot for about a period of 2 years. And I came to this realization that is really brutal. I got to tell you that if you ever have a realization like this, it's painful, which was, I don't know that much about creativity or consciousness after finishing a PhD program and doing a postdoc in this field. I don't really know anything about this. The only way I can know is I have to delve into this experience firsthand. And I tried to figure out a way that I could dive into the experience of inspiration. And it took me another 2 decades to figure this out. What if you could freeze frame that experience? You know, what if you could freeze frame that lightning bolt moment of eureka, aha, and penetrate it and see what is that made of? That's what the last 2 decades of my life have been about. So, and I've listened to the experts. I've listened to the artists, the poets, writers, inventors, and listened to what they had to say. And what I found is that there's a great overlap among those individuals who are immersed in creativity on a daily basis, the mystics of the world, and myself. And I think there's a reason for that. So the experience of creative inspiration. I recently had the pleasure of having my book trashed by Psychology Today. And I was delighted. If you could have had a video of me, you would have seen me dancing around my house. Because I made it to Psychology Today. So it's okay if they trashed me. And the reason they trashed me is they didn't understand it. They didn't understand. The guy was a Yale professor in psychology, and he didn't understand my book, and everything he said was a misrepresentation. So what I said was, creativity is defined in terms of the product. This is the way, what Joe alluded to is right. What creativity researchers do is they hand you a piece of paper or something, and they say, do something creative. Then they take the product out of your hands, they put it in the hands of a group of raters, and they rate it for two things: novelty. Is this new? Is this statistically unusual? Something that doesn't occur in the population? Is it adaptive, useful, functional, beneficial in some way? Because something can be novel, for example, the utterances of schizophrenics, but it's not necessarily useful to anybody other than schizophrenic. So there's a sense that it has to serve a function in the society. I found when I interviewed people who are immersed in the creative experience is they don't care about either of them. They don't care about novelty, and they don't care about usefulness, because they know it's useful, valuable. It's valuable to them. The experience was valuable. And novelty, well, anybody who's written songs, and I've written songs and chants, discovers every once in a while that you've just written a song that's already been written. I had a pleasure when I was 14 years old to go to a recording studio in Nashville. This guy who took me, we listened to this band play a really great song. And I was like, yeah, I love this song. This is really great. He goes, listen to it carefully. It's basically Sweet Home Alabama. And I was listening to it. I was, yeah, it kind of is. So these people, I don't know why none of their friends had the kindness in their heart to tell this band, don't record that song. It's been done. But the thing is, when they created that song, I'll bet they had as much of a thrill as if it was new. It doesn't matter that it's new. I've had moments when I was learning chemistry, I discovered Boyle's law, which is a law relating to pressure and volume. Unfortunately, Boyle beat me to it by 2 centuries. Now, that didn't take away from the thrill of discovery for me. I still feel that I shouldn't be called Boyle's Law. I think Victor's Law would be nice because I found that law myself. And nobody can tell me that I didn't discover it. Just because somebody discovered it 2 centuries ago doesn't mean a thing. So when you focus on the experience is fresh. There is, it's unlike any other experience you've ever had. There's an intensity to it. And actually, I'm going to borrow a copy of my own book from somebody. Does somebody have a handy copy of Deep Creativity? Oh yeah, thank you, Nancy. I'll give it back, I promise. I've already signed it, so. So this picture is of Peter Tchaikovsky. And there's a book called Conversations with Great Composers. It's truly one of amazing book. And Tchaikovsky is one of the people interviewed in it. And when he was asked about what his creative experience is like, this is what he said. It would be vain to try to put into words the immeasurable sense of bliss which comes over me directly when a new idea awakens in me and begins to assume a definite form. I forget everything and behave like a madman. Everything within me starts pulsing and quivering. This guy is pulsing and quivering in ecstasy when a piece of music comes to him. I mean, that's sounding more like a steamy romance than it sounds like a composer, a dignified composer creating. In the moment of creation, in the experience of inspiration, I say it's the first moment, it's the last moment, it's the only moment. I'm not comparing that moment to anything else. I'm fully alive at this moment and fully immersed in this. That's what I'm talking about, freshness. And then there's the element of transcendence, which is that experience of inspiration takes you outside of yourself and connects you with something bigger than you. At the very least, it connects you with a knowledge base that you didn't have a moment ago. And so that's on the right, very intense woman, is Mary Wigman, who is a pioneer of modern dance. And Wigman said, she wrote in her memoirs, during the process of artistic creation, man descends into the primordial elements of life. He reverts to himself to become lost in something greater than himself, in the immediate, indivisible essence of life. Thank you. And so she's saying what a lot of artists have said, what I experience, which is my best moments, my inspired moments, I lose myself. I disappear. I don't exist as such. I am not aware of myself at those moments. I have immersed myself into something far bigger than me. And so I want to know, what is that? When you have that moment of aha, you get this moment of discovery, epiphany, revelation, what are you connecting with at those moments? So my answer to you after 30 years, that might seem like a simplification, and it is. It's like, well, there's three components of what you experience at those moments of inspiration. Creator, creating, creation. And you go, well, that's semantics. Yes, absolutely, it's semantics. There's a creator, there's somebody who created. There's a process of creating, and there's a creation, that which got created. That's that which was created. And so let's look at those, because deep creativity challenges all of three of those and the assumptions that have been made in the field about all of them. So first of all, the creator. So here's a riddle for you. How many sources of creativity are there in the universe? I don't know how that got clipped. Would you say 7 billion, because there's 7 billion of us, more, less? More? Okay. Anybody else have a different perspective? 1! I say there's only one creator in the universe. There's only ever been one creator, one awareness from which all thoughts arise. When I create, I become one with that essence, that consciousness, that whatever it is, which we'll talk about. And Meister Eckhart, who's one of my favorite mystics, authors, profound beings in the world, he said, the eye through which I see God is the one through which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one love. The image you see on the cover of Deep Creativity is an image of the Eye of God nebula. And I feel very strongly that there's a reason that nebula, I mean, maybe it's just the angle at which the Hubble telescope took this image, but I think that it's symbolic that nebula looks like the human eye so much, that what's out there looks a lot like what's in here. And I'm going to talk about that in a few moments. So here's the part that might get a little challenging, and I've left it out of previous presentations. So Austin, you're the first. This I've added in there for you. It's in the book. But I said, so what exactly is that creator? And the thing is, I say the creator is the one consciousness of the universe. There's only ever been one consciousness. It doesn't even make sense to talk about consciousness in the plural. Consciousness says, doesn't that sound stupid? I think it sounds stupid. And so there's only one consciousness in the universe that's abiding in 7 billion of us. So when I create, I feel that I'm tapping into that one consciousness. I lose myself in that and I tap into that pure consciousness that is abiding in me as in you and in all things. Okay, if you buy that assumption, it's not relevant to just creativity. It changes the whole world. Because you have to say, oh, creator of the universe, I bow to you, I bow to you, I bow to you, I bow to you. Because that one consciousness is abiding in all of us. And it takes deep creativity right to the core of mysticism. If you buy this assumption, and this is the one that chases me out of the room when I'm talking to psychologists, and I tell them, I say, this is the part of the presentation that you're not going to like. and this is where the roads diverge. And it is. It's the point where the roads diverge. Because consciousness isn't what I think. Consciousness isn't what I know. Consciousness is I am. Consciousness is the I am that exists in you and in me. So you might say, I am Victor, I am Lynn, I am Bob. But the one thing we have in common is the I am, is the awareness, that consciousness, the essence, the being, I am. And at the same time, there's also I am not. Because in the beginning, assuming there was a beginning, in the beginning, so I studied the book of Genesis from a Jewish perspective when I was in elementary school. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. So it's like, okay, so before there was heaven and earth, what was there? So that means that before there was form, before there was anything to be, there was essence. There was an I am. And there was also an am not, because it is not any form. It's immanent. So the tricky thing about this consciousness that we're talking about is it's immanent. That means it abides in us, but it's also transcendent. It exists beyond us. So if you buy it, which maybe not everybody in this room buys it, that consciousness is pure essence. And so the question is, how does a formless consciousness embed itself, I just gave it away. How does it give rise to a universe of form? So again, when I learned that line, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, I was in second grade, and I thought, I was trying to visualize how that would happen. I tried to visualize some kind of toolbox with saw and hammer and nails and wood, but wait! Those things hadn't been created yet, because there's no form yet. So how the heck are you supposed to build a universe of form from formlessness? You see, this is where deep creativity gets a little deep. And the answer is, one of the first tenets of deep creativity is all creating is becoming. So that consciousness embeds itself in a universe of form. That's how it does it. So this pattern of essence and non-essence is replicated in every thought and everything. So what is a thought? A thought is I am. This is a table, but it's also what this table is not. So as soon as you identify a thought, as soon as you limit a thought and say this is a table, it's also not a chair, it's not a person, it's not everything else. There's a not table. And as soon as you do that, that dance of essence and non-essence that is consciousness embeds itself in the thought. And so I say the thoughts in here and things out there are homologous. That means that they're structured the same. There's a reason for that. Because are we really that certain that there is a universe out there outside of our thoughts? You go, sure there is. There's an objective reality. This table that I'm sitting on is real and I'm touching it. No, sorry, that can't be done. And I'm not saying this from any perspective other than the fact that I was a chemist and I studied physics. And in physics, you see these graphs of potential energy that say that the electrons on my finger and the electrons on the surface of that table, to bring them together would take more energy than exists in this galaxy. That means that I've never touched anything in my life because I can't. The electrons are too repulsive. I cannot touch this. So my impressions of space are illusory. And time is equally so, we know that. But neuroscience has shown us that there's a half-second delay between an event occurring and us becoming aware of it. That means that all these wonderful teachings, which I love and subscribe to, be here now, the power of now, they're talking about half a second ago. Sorry. That now it already happened. That's old news. That now that you're living in, the social sciences, especially psychology, is still functioning on this myth of objectivity that was settled about 90 years ago. Quantum physics basically said, look, this issue of subjective and objective was resolved. So Erwin Schrödinger, one of the great pioneers of quantum physics, he said, the world is given to me only once, not one existing and one perceived. Subject and object are only one. The barrier between them cannot be said to have broken down as a result of recent experiences in the physical sciences, for this barrier does not exist. Okay. So deep creativity is claiming there's only one creator. Is claiming the creation is always thought. Because whether there is an objective reality out there or not, we will never know, because we only know that objective reality, that quote-unquote objective reality, through our thought processes, through our subjective perspective. So to even have the discussion of, well, why is it that you and I agree that this table is here? Well, that could very simply be because we're of like mind to a certain degree. It could be that the contents of your mind and the contents of my mind overlap. And it's just that simple. It doesn't have to be that there's an objective reality out there, because we have no way of knowing it. So if you understand it, then deep creativity simplifies the process, because it says the creator, there's only one. So in science, there's the law of parsimony, which is that when given all else being equal, the simpler solution is preferable. It's more elegant. It makes more sense. So what's simpler? One source of creativity or 7 billion plus, right? And then you try to understand how the creation of thoughts out there, like you build a wall or whatever, you sculpt something, versus the things out there versus thoughts in here. Well, I'm saying it's the same thing. The process is homologous, because the creation of things out there and thoughts out here cannot be distinguished. So this is the Mandelbrot set. I think it's one of the most inspiring images that has ever been discovered. And some of you know more about the Mandelbrot set than I ever will. But Benoit Mandelbrot was working for IBM, and he was trying to he basically took this set of equations and ran it through, a very simple set of equations, and ran it through a computer program, and basically allowed it was the first time that mathematicians had the mathematical power, the computational power, to graph this thing ad infinitum. And what he found was this fractal. It's basically an image that's made up of itself. So it's mathematicians say it's self-similar. That means that at every level you see the same motif. The motif that makes up the whole image is also the motif that makes up all the parts of it. I say it's self-embedded. It's embedded within itself, within itself, within itself, infinitely. Mandelbrot claimed that the universe is a fractal. There's a ton of evidence for it. For example, if you look at the way the trees grow in the forest, it's the same pattern that you will find in each tree's limbs. The same pattern in which the limbs grow on a given tree. And if you look at the limbs in that tree, it's the same pattern as the twigs. And if you look at the twigs, it's the same pattern as contained in the leaf. And if you zoom in on the leaf, you would find that even at a more micro level, the same pattern regenerates. Well, why is that? Well, because this is how one consciousness embeds itself in a universe of form. It embeds itself at all levels. So that means that it's not just enough to say the creator exists within you and I bow to you, but the creator that exists within you as a whole being exists within your organs of your body, your organ systems, and your organs, and your tissue, and your cells, and your subcellular structures, and your macromolecules, and your atoms, and subatomic particles, and out into the far expanses of the universe. So that consciousness is embedded at all levels. So we don't have the sound, but basically I took and, oops, go back. I took this video, Michael Hogg, a guy who I've never met, I sort of borrowed that video and I put a soundtrack on it. And a group of people are saying this sort of mantra that came to me when I had seen the Mandelbrot set in 1996. About 20 years later, I came across it again and I had a different perspective on it. Oh my gosh, this is a model for how the universal mind is organized. That our minds are made up of thoughts, which are made up of subset of thoughts, of other thoughts, which in turn are made up of smaller thoughts, which in turn are imbued, all of them imbued with the one consciousness that is embedded at all levels of reality. So I had a group of people read, the source is entangled in the universe, layer upon embedded layer. There are no boondocks. And you go, what the heck is the no boondocks part? The no boondocks means that if you and I are living within this universal mind, and what the implications are that this universal mind is the set of all thoughts that have ever existed or ever will exist. So that means that at moments where I'm inspired, I'm tapping into the universal mind. I have access to the entire shooting match, all thought. You go, well, if that's true, why didn't I come up with a theoretical physics model, or why haven't I written any books on artificial intelligence or mathematics or microeconomics, Lord knows. And the reason is that that's not how I'm built, right? It's not my genetics and my upbringing and my interests, the things that float my boat and inspire me. That's not the stuff. I'm inspired by understanding what's happening in human beings when they create. So that's how I'm going. So we have at those moments access to the whole universal mind, but we only catch a certain amount of it in our butterfly net of our senses, our sensibilities. And so there are no boondocks means that if this is true, that all of us are embedded in this universal mind in which consciousness imbues everything, then what it means is that nobody got dealt a bad hand. Every once in a while I meet somebody, might be somebody in this room, that feels like they were dealt a bad hand in life. But if you understand this model, if you understand the idea that the universal mind is a fractal and that the consciousness that's in you is in every level, that means essentially that universes are contained within you and me. That means that universes of thought made up of, imbued with consciousness are at every level of who we are. Nobody got dealt a bad hand. There are no boondocks. The boondocks is where the action isn't happening. And the action is happening here, in you and in me at this moment. So when you look at this image, you see it. If you imagine that what this is we're looking at... Oh, okay, you can hear it.
Layer upon embedded layer. There are no boondocks.
The source is entangled in the universe. Layer upon embedded layer. There are no boondocks.
The source is entangled.
So no matter how deeply you delve into this universal mind, it's made up of itself, made up of itself, made up of itself infinitely. The consciousness that exists within each of us exists within every level, from which we're made up, every bit of us. So the great mystics of the world told us, if you're looking for the Tao, the way, the divine consciousness of the universe,
There are no boondocks.
The source is
there's no place that you're not going to find it, because it's entangled in our universe, in our universal mind, in every layer. And so we're part of that universal mind. Our individuals are part of that universal mind, and there's a rich universe of consciousness embedded within each of us. That makes us really spectacular beings. And at the moments where I experience inspiration, that's what I experience. So if you have doubt about the fact that you have access to the entire universe of thought, Then let me ask you a question. Is there anywhere in the universe where your imagination cannot take you? Even the most skeptical cynic I've ever met, when asked that question, he did, In theory, no. I said, gotcha. You just admitted that in theory, your mind is capable through the power of imagination to go anywhere in the universe. The far reaches to the smallest particles, anywhere, into realities that have never existed on this dimension that we call objective reality. There are more fantasy writers alive now than in all of history combined. I mean, it's incredible. And what it says is that we're living in a time of very fertile imagination. I mean, it's an explosion. We may not be managing the explosion of creative imagination very well, but it's there. It's spectacular. And I'm going to deviate for one moment because in the 1990s, there was an effect called the Flynn effect. I've never talked about this in any of these talks. The Flynn effect was a statistical effect where they looked at all the intelligence testing data from the time that intelligence testing data was ever collected. And they found that the raw scores, because the way they're scored is you take a raw score and then you norm it. That means 100 is average for that group. And so an IQ of 100 today is way higher than it was in 1920 something. So a group was brought together by the National Research Council to investigate it. And they said, well, this statistical effect called the Flynn effect, it can't be that we're getting more intelligent with every generation. Because if that were true, this is what they wrote in their paper, we would be living in a golden age, a Renaissance period, the likes of which the world has never known before. And that's not happening. Are you sure? Because my little smartphone over here isn't telling me that. So Einstein, to me, his greatness is not just about what he produced in terms of physics, but in terms of what he produced in terms of how physics is done. He didn't set out the special theory of relativity didn't come out of him sitting doing calculations. It came out of him taking a ride in his imagination on a beam of light. So he said, imagination is more important than knowledge. You've heard that. It's kind of like a little cliche thing. But you may not have heard this other part. Knowledge is limited, but imagination encircles the world. So if you're tapped into your imagination, you're tapped into the universal mind. The entire creation is at your disposal through your imagination. You can deny it, but when I ask that question to even the most skeptical cynics, they admit, yes, in theory, my imagination can go anywhere. So now I want to talk about the creative process itself. In nature, we see that creation is cyclical. Birth and death, the ebb and flow of the tides, waxing and waning moons. There's so much evidence of it being cyclical. That means that given the homologous nature, given that the creation process out there should be basically the creation process in here, that means the creativity has to be a cyclical process for each of us. And this is a problem that the researchers have a lack of understanding of, because they tend to think of creativity as point A, my starting point, point B is the product. And how do I get from point A to point B? As a result of that, a lot of the environmental problems we have are a result of that kind of thinking. Because You build a consumer product like this beautiful bottle, well crafted, well designed, but it only got designed halfway to the process. It only got designed until, I delivered some water, I drank it, it stopped working, the thing broke or whatever, and now what do I do with it? I toss it. Wait, you only designed halfway through the cycle. Because you got to the point where you mined the natural resources, you put them together, you manufactured it, you delivered it to the consumer who used it, and now what? Because everything that's born has to die, everything that's made has to be unmade. We know that. So the fact that creativity is not understood as a cyclical process is a problem. And yet, the great mythologies of the world have always understood that there is this creation cycle. The cosmogonic cycle is what Joseph Campbell called it. There's an emerging of form from formlessness, and it merges back into form. Think about your own thought processes. A thought arises right at this moment, and then a new thought arises after that. That means that between the rising of the first thought, something had to happen. That first thought subsided so that a new thought could arise into your awareness. So the dynamics of form emerging from formlessness and merging back is always happening. This is a creation cycle that's occurring at all times with all of our thoughts. And what Joe said in his introduction was something that occurred to me about a decade ago. I detail it in The Way of Play. I detail it in this book, Deep Creativity, which is that I feel very strongly that the two creative forces of the universe are joy and love. Joy is the experience of formlessness taking form, of consciousness imbuing itself in whatever you're enjoying. The thing that is enjoyed is completely, you give yourself completely, your awareness to it. And so I've had people say recently, I gave a talk in Tucson and somebody said, wait, sometimes the creative process isn't that joyful. It can be frustrating and anger and all of that, there can be, all the different aspects of creation. It's like, those are like the birthing pains, labor pain. And I'm not saying that. I'm saying that at the moment when form arises from formlessness, that's joy. That's how I define joy. You can define joy in whatever way you want, but that's how I define it. And love is the most destructive force in the universe. They didn't tell you that. You probably never heard that before this talk. Love can destroy everything. Jesus said, do not think I've come in peace. I've come bearing a sword. It's like, what? Samurai Jesus warrior? What the hell? I thought he was all about love. He was about love. He goes on to say, I'm here to I'm no longer quoting, right? I wasn't quoting perfectly anyway. I'm here to shred your idea of love because you probably didn't get it right. Because love is, if you only love your child or your spouse or your dog, that's not love. Love is like the universal solvent that dissolves two into one and that separates our boundaries. So the separation between us dissolves away, and I no longer exist as separate from you. I'm sure you know the love of something or someone that is so powerful that you would sacrifice your life for that person or thing, that being. Even sometimes people do it for strangers, where they, to jump on the railroad tracks to pull somebody out before a train comes. And I hear these stories and I'm always in awe of it. That I would sacrifice myself for something because I know that there's a connection that is so strong that I don't exist separate from that person. If that person died, I couldn't live anymore. And so love is that which takes form and dissolves it into the formless essence. So when I love you, lover and beloved are one. There's not a separation. So that's an important part of the creation process because everything that is born has to die. Everything that emerges from consciousness has to merge back into it. The dance of creation is always unfolding with these two forces that drive it. So one of my questions, so I started off by wanting to understand creative inspiration. And then it took me 2 decades, but I found that I could live in that space. And I want to live in that space of creator, creating, creation, where I am the single source of the universe that abides in you and in me, where I am the universal mind, all with access to all thought. And I am the process, the cyclical dance through which that source embodies form. And that space, I've had the honor to live in that space for the last few years. And so one of my questions is, how do you stay there? How do you not just get inspired, but how do you stay inspired? How do you live in the space of inspiration? And so this is really what I want to end with today. So there's 3 P's of inspiration: presence, passion, possibility. It's really creator, creating, creation, just being given a different name. So, presence. Presence is exactly what we think it is. We're fully present in this moment. How do you get fully present in this moment? Well, this is what the meditative traditions of the world have been teaching us to do. So you silence your mind. And how do you silence your mind? Well, the typical ways that meditation traditions teach is through concentration. You focus on one thing, a mudra, a gesture, a mantra, a sound, a mandala, an image. But wait, that's not going to emptiness. That's not going to consciousness with no thought. That's going to consciousness with one thought, being the focal point. So how do you go from one thought to no thought? Well, I feel that the answer comes from research on some phenomenon called retinal image stabilization. In 1961, a research paper was published where the researchers held an image constant relative to the eye. Eye moves up, the image moves up. So the image is being projected to the back of the eye in a constant way. The eye moves sideways, the image moves sideways. Eye moves down, the image moves down. If you keep an image perfectly still relative to the eye, can you guess what happens to that image? Disappears from view. Why is that? Well, the reason for that is that the human eye was designed to detect movement. And so if you still the eye, it goes blank. Well, guess what? The human mind was designed to move, to hop from thought to thought to thought. This is what we do. This is what the Buddhists talked about with the monkey mind. This is the monkey on the tree, jumping from branch to branch, limb to limb. If you hold the mind still on one thing long enough, it goes to no thing. So those individuals who say that there is no consciousness without thought, they just haven't gotten there yet. They haven't experienced it. Because let me ask you a question. How many people here have had an experience of consciousness in the absence of thought? Yeah, it's like, that's why we're in IONS, right? You know, so it's like, so you're going, what? Those people out there, they don't know. It's our secret. Not really, but they don't want to know. So I went to India and I found this whole phenomenon of Leela, divine play. And the idea is that the universe was created by a playful creator of joy, by joy, for joy. And one of the things I realized is I spent years trying to teach my students in consciousness classes to meditate. Do you know what happens when you ask a group of college students, or probably anybody, to meditate? Wiggling, jiggling, coughing, scratching, itching. The mind doesn't give up without a fight. And yet, when you watch people playing, especially children, they can throw themselves into play. From the time I was a little boy, I knew the experience of losing myself in play so that I didn't exist. I was completely immersed in that experience. I was having an experience of consciousness free of thought. And so I encourage people to do forms of play that are non-competitive, and so they're not goal-oriented, they're free-form, repetitive. I love yo-yos, and I love paddle balls, and I love spinning. My God, I spent my childhood doing this. You know, it was a cheap high, basically, for a 5-year-old, right? You'd spin around till you get dizzy and you fall on the ground, and it was like the best. And so we have forms of play. Part of the reason I say this is that not everybody's a meditator, but everybody can play. And so we can experience presence by playing, by immersing ourselves in play. And so you see, so I have my significant other, her son works in Pixar. He was very instrumental in the creation of the film Coco. And in Pixar, there's just toys everywhere. They have skateboards for them to get around the complex in, because it's such a big complex. So if somebody needs to meet somebody, they pick up skateboard and go taking off. And so they understand the critical nature of play in creation, in creative inspiration. And so they allow room for it. So then, next is passion. And for me, love and joy merge into bliss and ecstasy. That's partly my next book. And so our passion is our core gift in life. It's not what we're talented at. It's what we're passionate about that's the gift we have, because one leads to another. You know about the 10,000 hour rule, that if you do something for 10,000 hours, you gain expertise. 10,000 hours, that's 50 hours a week. I'm sorry, that's 20 hours a week. No, yeah. Let's say 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year for 5 years. So 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, you'll get 2-week vacation from it for 5 years to gain expertise. Who would do that? Who would play the piano or hockey or whatever? I mention hockey because Wayne Gretzky, when he was 3 years old, discovered his passion for hockey. He would sit down and watch Saturday night hockey in Canada, or whatever the show is called, with his parents. And when the hockey game would end and they turned on the TV, he would cry. And so he had his passion for hockey at age 3. I had my passion for sacred music at the same age. At 5 minutes to noon, Mahalia Jackson would come on the radio, would come on the television at 5 minutes to noon every weekday. And you know, Mahalia was a great gospel singer. She would belt out a gospel number. And my mom has come and heard me talk, and she has said, yes, this is true. She's verified it. I used to throw a hissy fit if I wasn't in front of the TV at 5 minutes to noon every weekday for Mahalia. Because there's something, you find that thing in your heart that is your central passion. And that driving passion brings you into the space of inspiration. Of course it does. And by the way, the role of passion in creativity, you know how much it's been studied by the psychologists? Very little. Virtually not at all. It's like what? They don't study intuition. When they study intuition, they define it as unconscious thinking, which it's not. They don't tend to study passion. They don't tend to study imagination. They define it as visual imagery, which that's kind of narrow. So they're missing out on the juicy stuff of the creative experience. In 2010, the field admitted that they don't know squat about the creative process. There was a review article reviewing all the literature in creativity, and they basically mentioned the word creative process 12 times. Most of them were like, boy, we should really try to figure out this creative process thing. I'm not joking. You read this paper and you go, wow. They never interviewed an artist, poet, writer, a sculptor, composer, inventor, nothing. Nobody did that research. None of that was cited in this article. They reviewed hundreds of journal articles, book chapters, monographs on creativity, and not once did they actually look at how human beings who immerse themselves in the creative experience every day create. And one of the things is that they have this driving passion. Part of the reason I always loved Michael Jordan is I heard an interview with him when he was still in college. And he talked about how he loves the game of basketball more than life itself. And he lives for that moment when the game is on the line. And everything is determined at a split second. You either make the shot and win or you miss the shot and lose. And he lived for that. And he took a lot of shots, and sometimes he missed the game-winning shot. But Lord knows he made a lot of them. And so he said, the greatest thing about the game of basketball to me is the passion, the love I have for it. Because when you have a love for anything, you'll go to the extreme to maintain that level. So I say, do you know what that is? Can I wake you up at 3 in the morning and say, what is that core passion of yours? Can you tell me what it is? Would you know? Like I would tell you at 3 in the morning, inspiration, can I go back to sleep now? But can you do it? Do you know what that thing is? I think our educational system has failed us because it didn't ever involve a single day where they said in class or in school, let's find our passion in life. And it can evolve because my passion for chemistry led me to my passion for coral reefs, which led me for my passion to inspiration, which led me to my passion for Austin, Texas. So that's how the dance works, right? One passion is like a springboard to many, many others. But you got to start somewhere. And then the third is possibility. How do you open up your receptivity and openness to that universe of thought that exists out there? Well, I believe that mindfulness techniques do that. Mindfulness techniques are designed to bring you into the space where you draw your attention to your whole field of awareness, all the thoughts in your awareness at one time, without focusing or grasping onto anything. Most of the people I've talked, I just met with a group of young spiritual seekers in Tucson. They're college students, and they all mentioned how brutally hard it was for them to try to master mindfulness. My beloved ex-sweetheart and partner in crime on a lot of projects, Jan Cold, and I wrote a book called Repose the Potent Pause. We fell into this position one day in a park, and I said, this has something. So this is repose. You lie on the ground or on a bed or on a mat or if you're lucky enough on a sandy beach or a lawn that doesn't have fire ants. And you lie there. I can't believe the fire ants thing. And so, and you lie there for 7 minutes. We did this research study and we put people through this and we had them lie in this position for 7 minutes 3 times a day. And after 30 days, we found all kinds of health benefits. Certainly mental health benefits, improved optimism and happiness levels, confidence levels, social functioning, psychological functioning. In terms of physical activity, fewer days of physical or work activity missed because of pain, injury, illness after 30 days. We had one woman who cured chronic insomnia that she had had for 6 years after the death of her husband, after a month. And she didn't believe it. We wrote about this in the Repose book. She didn't believe that it was, she thought, oh, okay, I'm fixed now. And she stopped doing Repose every day. And then the insomnia came back with a vengeance 6 months later. And then she was a believer, and then she started doing Repose every day, lying in Repose every day. And insomnia went away, and as far as we know, it stayed away. So that's not why I don't love Repose for that reason. I love Repose because when I started doing this 3 times a day, the book started to flow. And I started to be in that experience of inspiration. I started to live in that experience more. I could sustain that experience. The reason I believe it works is there's a phenomenon called somatic feedback. This again dates to William James. James said, sometimes the body leads the mind and not the other way around. You don't run from the bear because you're afraid. Because for you to process it, you have that half-second delay in awareness and go, bear, scary, run. Oh, you've just given that bear a big head start. Big. And you might just be bear lunch. You start running, your heart starts racing, your autonomic system kicks into gear, and you're out there. And then you go, oh, I'm running, my heart's beating, I'm sweating, there's a big object chasing me. I think I'm scared. So the fear comes last. They have done studies in psychology where this is really a complicated study. Okay, here, follow this. Take this pen and put it in your mouth. Put it like this. Or put it like this. Guess what? For people who did this, reported feeling happier than the people who did this. Really? Is it that simple? Somatic feedback. Put yourself in a happy face and you're happy. Put yourself on a sad face and you're sad. Put yourself in the most open, receptive state you can put yourself in physically, and your mind will follow. I'm proof of it. So I would say to you, if nothing else gets taken home from tonight, you should really think about doing repose. You should think, it's not even doing because there's nothing to do. And if you ask me, what do you think about when you're in repose? I don't care. That's why it's not meditation. I'm not teaching you how to do squat. Because the body will lead your mind where it needs to go. You don't have to work at it so hard. It's really so simple. You go, can't be that simple. It's that simple. So that is really something that I think you might want to take home. So that's it. Passion, presence, possibility. Put those things in place and you can live in this space. So my whole thing is how to stay inspired. My new blogs every Tuesday, except not yet today. Usually on Tuesdays. I have a new blog post on my website, victorshamas.com, and you can stay in touch with me in any number of these ways. And I have these books. So Deep Creativity is the current book, but I've written 3 other books, one on repose, one on the way of play, and my first book was about chanting as a tool for spiritual healing and physical healing. So, because it's my first time in Austin, I want to offer you a gift. If you buy the book tonight, and some of you have already bought it, I'll give you my first book, The Chanter's Guide, for free. And that's my gift to you because I'm really happy to be here with you. And so I say thank you very much. Tomorrow night we'll be chanting in this room at 7 p.m. So thank you very much. I hope some of you will join us, and I hope that the party tonight will continue a while longer. So thank you.
Thank you, Victor. That was wonderful. So we're gonna have about 10 minutes of Q&A. Then Victor will be in the back if you have some questions or discussion and or to buy inside the book. So about 10 minutes for Q&A. Okay.
I would love to, or even comments, whatever. You want to talk about something? Yes.
Yeah, how is this different from the flow state?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked me that question. Thank you so much. Okay, so here's the thing about flow. So, you know, this guy Csikszentmihalyi wrote this book about flow. And he defined flow as this peak experience that you have when you're doing a task that is challenging but not too challenging, and when you have mastery but not too much mastery. If it's too easy, you don't flow. If it's too hard, you get frustrated. If it's too challenging a task, you get frustrated. So flow is completely oriented towards doing, right? So I did a study with, I've done a study with hundreds of people, and in this study I asked them to describe their peak experiences. Describe a peak experience that they had in their life, a really profound moment that really carries over in their life. Now tell me, would you describe that experience as a doing experience? Were you doing something, or a being experience? Okay, so about almost 70% of the people I surveyed who were college students, so I mean, they weren't even in an IONS meeting. Because I know that this group might be biased more towards being. 70% of them reported being experiences. Sometimes it was lying in the grass, staring up at the clouds. That's a being experience. You weren't doing anything. There wasn't a task to accomplish. There wasn't some kind of a challenge. So I asked them also to rate how, in those experiences, how difficult, how challenging the task was at hand, or and how much mastery or how much. So mastery didn't play a part. So most people's peak experiences in this life are not doing experiences. The flow people got it wrong. So they drew this quadrant and they said, you know what happens if the challenge is low and and your mastery is high? They said that's boredom. Or there's no mastery needed. If your challenge is low and there's mastery is low because you don't need mastery, that's called boredom and apathy. It's like, that's not what I call boredom and apathy. Because when I have those experiences where I'm just being, those are my best times. Those are really profound times. I'm not doing anything. I'm not being challenged. I'm not mastering anything. Repose is a perfect example. How much mastery do you need for this? Not much. How much of a challenge is it? Well, if you have a problem lying down, maybe it's a bit of a challenge. But for most people, they rate the challenge of it really low. And yet, I love repose. So one of the things they found is they couldn't understand. These researchers studied these people who were in flow in the workplace. But then they'd come home and they'd lounge around the couch. You go, why are you doing that? That's boring. That's not flow. Well, it feels good to lounge around the couch. And so you might like flow at work. But all I'm saying to you is what's happened in psychology is flow is equated with peak experiences. Flow and peak experiences are essentially synonymous in the minds of a lot of psychologists out there. And I'm saying it's one type of peak experience and involves doing, but there are a whole lot of other ones that are being missed. So at the end of that book, I say, I kind of trash flow a little bit because I really feel like my data aren't consistent with flow. You know, flow, some people have the experience of flow, but most of them, that's not.
Is it because it's a sports connotation to it a lot? Michael Jordan, you put Michael Jordan.
Right.
Would be the penultimate example of flow.
Absolutely. So,
For the psychologist.
and then they have this experience while they're doing. I mean, there's this great book, In the Zone. If you haven't read this book, Rhea White and what's his name? One of the co-founders, Michael of Esalen. Michael, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know the book.
Whatever his name. In the Zone describes these peak experiences that athletes have. Sometimes they have the experience where they're playing a game of basketball and they anticipate 4 or 5 plays ahead what's going to happen. And these athletes like Isaiah Thomas or Bill Russell or these great basketball players have reported those experiences. Michael Jordan's one of them. They look like flow. And Michael Jordan, when he retired from basketball, it was a crisis because all he knew, his passion was completely linked, his peak experiences, to playing a game. Now what? Can you have a peak experience just sitting? Because, you know, a lot of the world's great masters, spiritual masters, have taught about sitting. That sitting can be a peak experience, and you don't have to do anything. You can just sit. You can lie in a position like repose. You can have peak experiences that aren't flow. And that's all I'm saying. Flow is great, it's not enough. Yeah.
This is not a trick question.
Okay.
But is it possible, or have you linked everything you said, or a lot of what you said tonight, to the Kabbalah and to Kundalini?
A little bit. And so with the Kabbalah, for example, the essence and non-essence idea, in the Kabbalah there's this idea of the creator as being in, which is nothingness, void, and Ein Sof, which means without limit. So it means infinite and occupying no space, and not existing. So that's a really wonderful paradox that exists in the Kabbalah tradition, and it makes perfect sense to me because I've experienced it. The thing I would say about this book is that it's naive in a way. I wrote it intentionally that way. I know what these mystical traditions are. I quote them, but my book is based on my experiences. And that's why you shouldn't take anything you read in Deep Creativity at face value. I say along the way, try it, experience it, get there. I don't believe a scientist, and certainly don't believe me. It's doable. You can live in that space of inspiration. And so find the way to get there. And I'm just trying to leave some markers so that people can get there. And so while I am interested in Kabbalah and Zen and Kundalini and all of these traditions, I also want to make my experience be the core. The thing that after 30 years, the one thing I'm expert at is what's happening inside of me during these experiences. That's all. I basically said, I'm going to devote myself to becoming an expert introspectionist. You know, there was an introspectionist tradition in psychology. It was about how to introspect and explore your own internal experience. And that's hard. And that's why it took me 30 years. Yeah.
When you refer to passion, is that pretty much a constant throughout your life, or does it change?
Oh gosh, what about your life?
Like when you talk about it.
Like for me personally, or for anybody?
For anybody. I guess because it's hard to find for a lot of people, that passion.
Well, the thing...
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, the question is, is passion constant or does it fluctuate? And I think that we know that it fluctuates. It's hard to maintain passion. Look, how many of us in this room have been in love? Yay! How many of us who have been in love with that, whoever you're thinking of that you raised your hand, how many of us are still in love? Now you see the fewer hands went up the second time. So you knew at some point great passion, and you didn't, but you couldn't maintain it. I want to maintain it, and it's not easy. It's like that is a practice. I have to believe that being in love is not about the other person, it's about me. Being in love is something that self-generated. The other person inspired it. But being in love, like my teacher in the Chanter's Guide, he was a shaman from Oaxaca, and he would say, you'd say, how are you feeling today? He goes, oh, I'm in love. And it was very convincing, because the idea was in love is a state of being that it doesn't have to be temporary insanity. Passion doesn't have to be a temporary thing. The fires of passion can be fueled, and I can tell you this. It's an intense way to live. And I think a lot of people back off of it because it's too intense. Like, oh God, just the thought of living in passion every day. What, I have to be in love with my spouse? What does that mean? I have to make love tonight. Yeah.
I guess what I meant was you knew it was sacred chanting was your passion throughout your life. Does that change?
So again, like for me, I find the sacred chanting, there's moments in my life where I'm so passionate about it that that's all I want to do. And then there's times in my life that my passion is talking about something like this with you. So that's a great example. Global Chant, spent 22 years creating it. This year I backed off of it to a great degree because I wanted to put my energies into this. I wanted to meet you. You're my community. I want to connect with you. Your community I haven't met before. And I want to share about about inspiration with you. I want you to share about inspiration with me. So yeah, our passions evolve. And what I think is you follow one passion and it leads to a million others. That's the beauty of it. Yeah, Anne.
Well, before her question, I was going to make a comment because as you were talking, you were just triggering things in my brain, right and left, and I can't even remember them all now, but that's okay. But one of the things, in the last 6 months, I've gone through this, we'll call it to be as polite as possible, a plateau period
Uh-huh.
where I really could not do anything. And it was so unlike me that it bothered me a little bit, but I really didn't have the energy to be bothered by it. So I just allowed it to happen.
And were you enjoying it or not?
Well, I had no desire to do anything. And it came after the flu. So for a while I thought it was flu residue, lack of energy, maybe it was. But I mean, I was happy for a couple of months sitting on the couch with a book in front of me, doing nothing, including not reading the book.
And you liked it.
And I liked it. That was the thing. It was like, how can you like doing absolutely nothing and letting your mind sit still for months? And I knew that there wasn't much I could do about it except beat myself up, which wouldn't make myself feel better. So I decided to just let it go and see what happened next.
Awesome.
And what's coming out is the ability to respond with a jillion ideas when you talk. And the ability to get excited about things which I had lost in the dailiness of life.
Yeah.
So and in a way it was like a passionless period, but my passion was to do nothing.
Beautiful. And so you look at the sleep cycle. The most creative period in our day for a lot of us is REM, when we're dreaming. And what is it followed by? What is it preceded by? It's always preceded by deep sleep. And in deep sleep, there's not a whole lot of mental activity going on. If you wake people up from deep sleep, if they report anything at all, it's kind of fuzzy. It's not like a dream. So what that means is before that moment of creative explosion, there's this moment of silence.
Yeah.
And you were just living in that space. And by the way, what you experienced isn't that unusual, is unusual for here, but Italians live that way. I mean, the whole country really knows, respects it. In fact, there's a term about far niente, which means the art, let's see, how does it go? El arte, what is it?
The art of doing nothing.
The art of doing nothing, right? So it's the art of doing nothing. And in our society, you know what? When I spoke about the way of play, when I went and wrote that book and I talked about play, I thought I was going to get stoned by the audience, by some of the people I talked to. Because in play really pushes our buttons as Americans. You know, there used to be the saying, work like a dog, but let's face it, our dogs have a really cush life. The Russians say, work like an American. That's their equivalent of work like a dog. So we're a society on a treadmill. And even the scientists who study these things are on a treadmill. All they know is doing. So they can't imagine being. All they know is thinking, so they can't imagine experience without it. So we're in a society out of balance, and it shows even in the way we approach a subject like this. Yeah?
I was one of those people that answered, there are 7 billion plus consciousness. I believe that we all had an individual consciousness. There was possibly a collective consciousness, which we tap into, and then a universal or God mind that some of us are able to tap into. I've had glimpses of it, but only small glimpses of it. And it was refreshing to hear you say that there is really only one consciousness, and it resides in all of us. But then you also said that in order to be able to access it, to fully access it, you need to relax or be open. I think I'm there. I certainly have the desire, I have the openness, but I still don't have the access. I don't know what I'm missing.
In Islam, there's a line about the Creator being closer than your own jugular vein.
Yeah.
And so that sometimes things are too close and we're so immersed in it that we don't know it. But you know, the great mystical traditions, one of the things I did was when I arrived at this conclusion that the source is one, which I write from personal experience. I had moments where it was like a past life regression, only to no life that I've ever lived, to an experience without being in a body, a place beyond space and time. And the way I know that exists is I've been there, and I believe you've been there. And the problem is that sometimes it happens in a flash. And what we're just trying to do is learn how to live in that space. And then you'll know that it's there. And when you know that it's there, then you go, you see, the greatest message, in my opinion, in the history of humanity is the kingdom of heaven is in you. So, I know we're done, right? So this is my last thought. As somebody who grew up Jewish, we were taught that there's an age, the Messiah is going to come and usher in an era of heaven on earth, the kingdom of heaven. Jesus came and said, oh, this kingdom of heaven you're looking for is in you. So he did. He ushered in the kingdom of heaven. And we missed it. So what if we're living in the kingdom of heaven and we missed it? That's a funny, funny joke. So the kingdom of heaven is where the divine dwells. And he's saying it dwells in you and in me as in all things. And all the mystics have said it. The Tao exists in everything. If the Gospel of Thomas says, cut a piece of wood and you will find me there. There's no place where I am not. So the issue is the issue, and no offense, IONS people, but we're cerebral about something that is gut and blood and heart and body. And it's like, let's step out of that. It's fun to talk about. I love talking about this stuff. I love the intellectual pursuit, but I know that the reason I love it is because there's an experience that transcends that thought, and that's where I want to live. And we can live in that space. So you had the blessing of this illness or whatever it was, pushed you out of your head, and you got to be and do the art of doing nothing.
Well, the interesting thing was, I wasn't paying my bills. I wasn't meeting with clients. I wasn't doing anything, and I don't live on a back cushion. There's this can't work very long. But I look at my bank account, and there was more money than when I started.
Yay!
And I paid the bills when I got a notice that said, we're going to cut this off. That only took my attention, twice. It's just, it worked. It worked out.
It's awesome. Well, I want to hear more about that, Ann. Well,
Thank you, Victor. Thank you so much.
thank you. Hope to see you at the social.
Will you come back?
Oh, heck yeah.